Morning, and thank you for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center for this webinar on the housing needs of rural America. I'm Andy Winkler, the director of BPC's Housing and Infrastructure Project. This is our first webinar since launching the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy just last week, our first single issue policy center at BPC. The center is focused on realizing a decent, safe, and affordable home for every American family. In addition to the center, BPC has been leading a housing council since early this year, a bipartisan group of more than 20 of the country's leading housing experts. The council is helping BPC kind of identify and prioritize policies that, one, ensure we continue to meet the urgent housing needs of Americans affected by the pandemic, advance racial equity and opportunity through housing, and preserve and build affordable homes to strengthen families and their financial resilience and help to propel our country's economic recovery. One of the council's co-chairs, Seth Appleton, has graciously agreed to lead today's discussion. Seth has a wide range of experience on housing policy in and out of the public sector, having spent time working for Congressman Sam Graves and Luke DeMeyer of Missouri, in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, Ginnie Mae, and now in his role leading MISMO, which is the standards development body of the mortgage industry and a subsidiary of the Mortgage Bankers Association. So Seth, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to do this. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ian. BPC's Housing Council and discuss a topic that's frankly near and dear to me. As Andy mentioned, I've actually worked on these issues for a number of years, including on the Hill in offices representing rural communities across the state of Missouri. And my in-laws actually still live about 5 miles outside of a town of 1,000 people in Northwest Missouri. So I have some familiarity with the housing challenges that folks are facing right now. Rural America is diverse with unique assets, challenges, economies, and communities. But like most of our country, rural households are increasingly facing housing insecurity and high housing cost burdens, while also grappling with more severely substandard housing conditions and limited access to credit. So that's why we're so grateful that Senators Tina Smith of Minnesota and Mike Rounds of South Dakota, the chair and ranking member, respectively, of the Senate Banking Subcommittee on Housing, Transportation, and Community Development, could join us today. They have been stalwart champions of rural issues, forming the Bipartisan Senate Rural Economic Working Group in 2019 to highlight what's working in rural America, to lift up local ideas and to work in a bipartisan manner to support rural communities and their revitalization. So today we hope to learn a little bit more about their ideas and priorities for rural housing and opportunities for bipartisan collaboration this Congress. A timely conversation given everything that's happening this week on the Hill for sure. One piece of housekeeping before we get started. For anyone watching us live today on YouTube or Facebook, you can submit any questions in the chat or tweet them to @BPC_bipartisan. The BPC team will be monitoring and we'll try to answer a couple at the end of today's session. But first, to do some level setting, I'm honored to hand the floor over to Senator Smith for some brief opening remarks, followed by opening remarks from Senator Rounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. It is fantastic to be with all of you. I want to thank Seth and Andy and the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing us all together today. And certainly to my colleague, Mike Rounds from South Dakota. Mike, it's great to see you virtually, although I think we're probably going to see each other on the Senate floor in a couple of hours or so. You know, Mike and I ride on the same airplane back and forth to the Midwest twice a week, and we've gotten to know each other, as I call it, the school bus, as we go back and forth. And you know, sort of through that connection to rural America and Midwestern America, we started to think about the work that we could do together to lift up the issues that are so salient to folks living in small towns and rural places across the country. And you know, what happened is that I was doing a lot of visiting in small towns, and I was so struck by the innovation, the diversity, the assets in these communities. At the same time, when I was having conversations with folks that live in the big cities, they kind of approached small town and rural America, either like it was some sort of quaint historic place that people love to go visit, or they were focused on the deficits in these communities. And I just thought that was just a backwards way of looking at this. Certainly, rural America has great need, and the needs are unique. But you need to approach it, I thought, as did Mike, from the perspective of what are the assets of these communities that we can build up. And that is really what led Mike and I to found the Rural Economic Working Group, bipartisan in the Senate, along with Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin and Deb Fisher from Nebraska. And I think that that partnership has also really informed our partnership on the Senate banking, how on the subcommittee that I chair and Mike is ranking member. When it comes to bipartisanship in the Senate, I often feel as if we sort of live in it's like a tale of two cities. There is the city in Washington and the politics of Washington that you see on Fox News and MSNBC, and it looks like all we do is fight with each other all day long, day after day. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we have significant policy differences and differences in approach between Republicans and Democrats. Nonetheless, I think there is this other Washington, which is the Washington that Mike and I try to live in as much as we can, which is the place where people come together, they try to find common ground, and they try to figure out how to actually solve problems and not just win arguments. And that is why I am so grateful for my partnership with Mike, with Senator Rounds, because that's the way he approaches things so often. Just in the short time that we have been working on our subcommittee on housing and transit, we've had 3 subcommittee hearings focusing on areas of shared interest, including rural transit, including challenges with rural housing. Especially Mike and I are concerned about the deep challenges of access to housing and overcrowding and on tribal land. As well as challenges we have to make sure that folks living in publicly subsidized housing have the opportunity to live in safe and decent places. So as I think about this conversation today and how I'm excited to be here with all of you and have this discussion. I want to just sort of say finally that I start from the place that if you don't have a safe, stable, affordable place to live, nothing else in your life works. Not your education, not your job, not your health. Housing is really fundamental to that. And as we think about the needs in rural America, small town America, for housing, it is one of the biggest challenges that we have. It's certainly a family issue, a family stability issue. It is an economic issue, as businesses tell Mike and I all the time, that the shortage of housing, shortage of affordable housing in rural communities is a real economic barrier as they work to recruit and retain the workers that they need to fuel that rural economy, which fuels our nation's economy. So thanks so much for the chance to be with all of you. I look forward to the conversation, and it's great to be with you.
Thanks. And now we'll go to Senator Rounds.
Hey, good morning. And yeah, Tina's absolutely correct. We're part of a group here in which we look at the schedule on a regular basis. And the question is which one of those school buses are we going to be on at the end of the week? And on Mondays when we're coming in, it's a matter of, well, how many other folks are going to be on the school bus that I'm going to have coming in? And, you know, we talk about it. Tina and I are both in an area, some people would call it flyover country. For us, it's fly to country. And at the same time, there's limited amount of transportation back and forth. And we really have had the opportunity on a number of occasions to actually sit and visit and talk about the really unique challenges that we've got in rural areas. And just as an example, I mean, about half of the people in my state of South Dakota live in what you would probably define as a rural setting. They have the same challenges everybody else does in terms of trying to make sure that they've got a place where they can get good, clean food, and they've got access to services, doctors, healthcare, and housing. And the housing is something that Tina and I have both been, kind of focused on here with our role on the banking committee, and specifically on the housing subcommittee. And it's been a pleasure to work with Tina. In the United States Senate, you have to have a bipartisan approach. And at one time before I stepped in to my role as a member of the United States Senate, I worked with the Bipartisan Policy Council as a former governor, and I enjoyed that relationship that we developed across party lines. in the United States Senate, you have to have that in order to get anything done, because it takes 60 votes in order to even address or to consider legislation at all. And so you're always constantly trying to find a way to bring people from both sides together. And that's what we've tried to do here. In fact, I was looking back on some stuff today. Right now, we've got 4 initiatives that I'm working on with regard to rural housing. 3 of the 4, Tina and I are doing together. And I mean, to me, that's really important to talk about, the fact that you can put together those relationships, you can find common ground, and that will cross party lines. And if you want to get anything done in the United States Senate, you've got to cross those party lines. The end result is that if you're able to do that and develop those relationships and actually work on good public policy, and you do it on a bipartisan basis, you can make a difference. And that's what I think we're doing right now with regard to housing. And our goal is to address those critical issues that you find in rural areas that you might not find in your more urban settings. And so I appreciate the opportunity today. And as Tina has said, we enjoy working together. We understand that we've got differences of opinion on some policy areas, but the fact that we're both in an area which is primarily rural, it means that we've got to be able to work and to find common ground. And the bottom line is we can make things better and the quality of life goes up in our communities and in our states.
Was interested in hosting this today because of your shared commitment to help your constituents address these issues in a bipartisan way. You know, one thing that's really thrown a wrinkle into rural America, right, has been the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's influenced the way we live and certainly work. You know, we're all here on Zoom today, and certainly folks in rural America have had challenges over the years with broadband internet infrastructure and whatnot. But it's also, the pandemic has really underlined and underscored the importance of having a safe, stable home, you know, to live and work from for many folks. And, you know, it's highlighted the, you know, financial and housing affordability issues that many of your constituents face. How do you think, and we'll start with Senator Smith, how do you think the pandemic has, you know, specifically affected the housing needs of the rural Americans that you represent in Minnesota?
Well, thanks, Seth. You know, I think that in small towns and rural places in this country, the housing, pretty significant housing challenges existed before COVID. In 2019, I did a whole tour of Minnesota talking specifically about housing issues, including several roundtables focused directly on challenges on tribal land. And the challenges that existed before COVID were right there. But what I think has happened is that COVID has laid bare these challenges for everyone to see, and particularly the deep inequities that we have in housing. This is a question of both supply and demand, as I see it. One, on the demand side, there is just a fundamental mismatch in small towns and rural places between what people can afford and how much housing costs. It's like the market is not aligned in any way for a lot of folks. And then on the supply side, there is just the market is not coming close to producing the number of housing units, either for rental or for home ownership, that are required. And COVID has made that worse with many folks, particularly people working in the in restaurants, hospitality services, or other kind of low wage service sectors, losing their jobs, and that has made the challenge even worse. At the same time, COVID hasn't been the great equalizer. A Minnesota farmer said to me, with COVID, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And Mike and I have talked a lot about this in the ag sector. You had some sectors that were booming during COVID as people's consumer choices changed, and then shrinking in other sectors. And then that ended up putting additional pressures on housing as well. So I think the question is, what can we learn from this? What have we done right during COVID that we want to continue? And that, I think, is something that we're both really, really focused on. I mean, for example, I'll just say quickly that I think that our efforts around providing rental assistance have been very valuable Yet at the same time, we know that emergency rental assistance dollars have not been getting out the door at the pace that we need. And so that's sort of an example, I think, of how some very good things have happened, but we have to continue to work to make sure they're working well.
Senator Rounds, what about in South Dakota? How do you think the pandemic has affected your constituents, particularly when it comes to their housing needs and choices?
Yeah, look, the global supply chain, which was significantly disrupted, made it very difficult for any type of new construction to be completed. And so you didn't have new homes being built. And you need those, even in rural areas. The other side of this that I think people sometimes forget about is in our rural areas, whether you're talking about in South Dakota or Minnesota or any place else, we're heavily into agriculture, and you've still got folks on the farms and ranches that are cyclical in terms of what they have to get done. So we had farmers and ranchers, even in the worst part of the COVID pandemic, they were doing their daily work and they were going to town, they were getting supplies, but they needed to get their fertilizer, their seeds, their chemicals, their fuel, and so forth. And those different types of products had to be delivered to them out on the farms, ranches, but they needed that, and it wasn't a matter of, well, we can get it in a couple of weeks. It had to be done based on the cycle of the year, and so those folks were still working, and yet at the same time, any place where you had a larger group of individuals, where we were really saying you need to shut down your operations. If you shut down your operations in a fertilizer plant, it means that you don't have the fertilizer for the farmers and the ranchers. And so there was really that rub back and forth of how do we continue to provide it in the economy to continue to roll during the times of a pandemic. Now, you've also got a challenge in that with healthcare, you still had people in small towns who maybe weren't interactive with thousands of people, but they were still catching COVID. And in many of those areas, we have a higher percentage of people that are older, and they were more susceptible to having real illnesses at a time in which we didn't have vaccinations available to us. But they don't have the healthcare capabilities in rural, in small towns as what you would in some of your larger communities. So how do you take a grandma or a grandpa who doesn't have access to the emergency, the emergency needs that you could have in a larger community, and you're going to move them away from family and friends? You're going to put them in a facility someplace where they have access to those emergency items. That disrupts an entire community, and it disrupts multiple families. And so rural communities, when they had to have a loved one leave and go someplace else to get the emergency care, that's extremely disruptive. And it's not just to one or two people, it's to an entire community. So yeah, the COVID-19, number one, you didn't have access to really good healthcare in your rural communities. You've got to get to a larger community. And second of all, you still got to be able to do what you call your economy. And at the same time, you're still subject to the risk of that pandemic. And the global supply chain was shut down. Farmers and ranchers in the farming community, if you were in the cattle business, you weren't going to get the same price for your cattle because the packers, who control 80% of the market, they ran out of the ability to actually process meat because they had to shut down their facilities. And that impacted the price for those folks. And yet at the same time, these farmers and ranchers had to take care of livestock that were going down in value and who were past the point of maturity. What do they do? And some of them had to literally, they basically kill their livestock. And you think that doesn't take an emotional toll. So a lot of really bad stuff happened during that pandemic. And it's one of the reasons why both Tina and I have pushed so hard to make sure that we get those relief efforts out into the communities, and the vaccinations. We continue to tell everybody, get vaccinated, they're safe, they're effective, and that's the message that we continue to push out into the rural areas as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Senator Rounds. And I want to follow up with you first and then go to Senator Smith afterwards. But, you both brought up the relief efforts that Congress has been engaged in for the last year and a half now. Are you confident that the resources are reaching those that need them the most? And kind of in the months ahead, like where should policymakers and other stakeholders be focusing their efforts to make sure that one, the assistance is reaching those it's intended for, and two, making sure that people continue to be stably housed.
You know, let me just, first of all, I think the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, I think it had its headaches, but it was probably one of the most successful in terms of a strategically successful item for keeping small businesses open. Basically, we would pay for we'd give them enough money to where they would actually be able to pick up their payrolls, and about 20% on top of that for the benefits and so forth. And so I think that one was successful. The challenge there is that we went back through banks, and in a lot of cases through the Small Business Administration, there was a real hiccup there trying to get the technologies to all jive. Where we were successful, and it wasn't the federal government so much that was successful, but there were a lot of small town banks who just literally sat for 48 hours trying to get into the system so that they could help their business customers. They really were the heroes in this, those loan officers that sat there and just kept plugging away because they knew that those businesses were done if they didn't get it. So despite ourselves, I think that was probably the best. The other piece, there was a time there in which that supplemental assistance for unemployment benefits really was very helpful. Now, I think Tina and I may have a disagreement on how long it should have continued on, but most certainly during the height of the pandemic, that was extremely helpful to a lot of folks who had lost their jobs and who we made it through. Bottom line is we did that on a bipartisan basis, and they were successful, and that money did get out through the states or through the SBA back to where it needed to be. Hiccups, yeah, but it's probably one of the best examples of bipartisan efforts to actually fix this. And the other piece on this that I'm going to say is what we did in terms of actually getting the vaccines done in a rapid rollout will probably go down as one of the most successful efforts by a government to address a pandemic in history. The way that it was developed over an extended period of time, but literally the warp speed, it did work. And that was done on a bipartisan basis with billions of dollars put in to help what had started as a DARPA, a dark research project, and over a period of about 10 to 15 years was given back out into the science community. Those vaccines and the development of that vaccine really has been truly a lifesaver and an economy saver as well.
Excellent. Senator Smith?
Well, thanks. So I completely agree with Mike that the bipartisan efforts that we did with the Paycheck Protection Program made a huge difference in shoring up small businesses in rural places and small towns. And also completely agree with Mike that, you know, we're so thankful for the community banks and the credit unions, and then increasingly in the second and the following rounds, the community development financial institutions that help to make sure that those paycheck protection programs and other supports for businesses were getting out. That made a huge difference. Sometimes we forget that in those initial bipartisan bills, we also provided huge support to keep hospitals up and running in rural places. And this was extremely important. You know, it was kind of counterintuitive in the midst of a global pandemic that hospitals, and especially rural hospitals, that had to shut down their so-called elective activities in order to keep space for people that were sick with COVID, ended up losing a lot of revenue as a result of that. So I'm really glad for that bipartisan work. I'm including specifically help projects that I worked on to make sure that municipally owned hospitals were able to participate in that Paycheck Protection Program. I also just want to say, comment briefly about the rental assistance program, which I think made a huge difference. You know, there were two tranches of that. One was bipartisan. The second part, the Democrats did through the reconciliation process. And I think that was significantly, that has been really helpful in keeping people in their rental units. Now, you know, and just to give you a sense of context for this, in Minnesota, alone, about 60,000 families are behind on their rent right now. And so that gives you a sense of the need. Now, it has been very difficult to stand up the infrastructure to get these dollars out the door, and it hasn't happened nearly fast enough. I think out as of, my most recent numbers, out of that 60,000, only about 16,000 have actually received help through the emergency rental assistance program. So we have a long way to go. We're making improvements. Treasury has simplified their rules, and the implementers are often state and local organizations that are, I think, making a big headway. But it's very important right now that we get those dollars out the door as quickly as possible. And of course, this affects tenants, but it is a very important driver for those small town landlords that are have foregone rental income, and it's having an impact on their ability to pay their mortgages and to maintain their buildings. And the last thing we want to do is to lose that housing right now when we already have such a crunch in terms of housing supply.
Thank you for that. I want to switch gears because, we have a senator from Minnesota and one from South Dakota. This will be a jump ball, so whoever would like to start first, but both of you have significant Native American populations in your respective states, and housing needs in tribal areas are often pretty severe and the circumstances dire. 23% of Native Americans on tribal lands live in physically substandard housing compared with 5% throughout the rest of the US population. There's also significantly more overcrowding compared to the national numbers. How have you worked together to elevate and address the concerns of your tribal constituents and tribal communities in Congress and when it comes to housing?
Well, maybe Mike and I will divide this up a little bit because this is near and dear to both of our hearts. The very first hearing that we had, the very first housing subcommittee hearing that we had was focused on challenges around Native housing. And we've had the chance to do some, I think, really good work together on this. And I'll just mention one bill, and Mike will tell you about others that we've worked on. A bill that we introduced this July is the Native American Rural Homeownership Improvement Act. And what this would do is expand and make permanent a pilot program to support Native American home ownership. Folks don't always realize the complexities on tribal land where the land is held in trust of getting mortgages because you don't own the land, which is an often very important part of the collateral, but you only own the house. And so this is actually a pilot project that has been very successful with the USDA and native CDFIs. And Mike and I are working to make that pilot project expanded and make it permanent. So that's one thing we're doing, but there are others. And Mike, do you want to tell about the rest of it?
Yeah, look, and I totally agree. This lending and providing assets or providing the funding so that you can actually build housing or literally have housing on reservations. We're so far behind on that in this country. It's just unbelievable. But you got to start with the basics. Number one, how do you get rural water there? How do you get electricity there? How do you get sewer systems in place? So if you're going to build housing, you've got to have that. Well, in an urban setting or in a town setting, you've got developers that come in and do that because they're going to be able to make good money. But where you've got real poverty, which is on the reservations, you don't have somebody coming in to develop it because there is no assured source of income coming in from that development. But second of all, once you've even figured out a way to put that together, and we've done that through rural water systems, REAs have come in and so forth. So there are some of those programs, but then you've still got to figure out a way to actually get, as Tina says, how do you get title? Or how do you get somebody to loan you money to build a house on land that's being held in trust by the federal government or the tribe? And how do you then protect that person that's lending the money that if they do default, that they can actually do something as collateral on the house? So those have been the challenges, and they're unique challenges. And in a rural area, how do you get the contractors to come into a place that may be 60 or 70 miles from a regular town to go to a reservation to actually begin building and putting the construction together? One items that we have done so far, we did get a reauthorization of the NAHASDA, which is basically it's a group of 9 programs at Housing and Urban Development to establish the Indian Housing Block Grant Program, which was specifically aimed at improving Indian housing. So rather than all of these separate ones, we put them all together, and that reauthorization is something that we're both working on today. The other item that I that I think is really important is there are the local or organizations that understand how to get things done in Indian country, which by the way is a defined term, and they understand how to get and to accept title. How do you collateralize a house and so forth? And they do it on reservations, and they do it on a regular basis. But to get them more money so they can actually put that back into their communities is really important. The other item that I would emphasize is this. There's a significantly higher percentage of Native Americans who are veterans, and yet they have not been able to access VA loans. In fact, the Minneapolis office of the VA actually got an award 3 years ago for having the most number of VA-issued mortgages to reservation locations in the entire country. They had 5 in 1 year, and they were given an award for that. That tells you how broken that part of the system was. So it's a challenge. Number one, you've got to get the financials available. If you don't have a bank on a reservation, where do you go to borrow the money? So you've got to have these CDFIs, and you've got to use them, these community development funds, in order to get that money. And that's kind of what Tina and I have been working on, is making sure that the money's available to them so that they can actually loan the money out because they know how to do it on the reservations. And then to recognize that you've still got to have developers that have to have a process in place so that they can get water, sewer, and electricity to those development locations.
Thank you for that. And you both have been very instrumental in these issues and have come at it with a collaborative, bipartisan approach, which is something that we at the Bipartisan Policy Center are really striving to achieve as well. And one of the things I noticed about the Rural Economic Working Group that you both formed is its focus on lifting up local ideas, local success stories, local approaches. Or is there something that has stood out to each of you, as you've toured your states and the country that everybody should know about and be trying to emulate in their neck of the woods?
Yeah, look, Tina, you want to go or you want me to go?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay. Sometimes people don't realize the value of those partnerships. When I was governor in South Dakota, we put together what we called the Ellsworth Authority. That was because the Ellsworth Air Force Base had been targeted for shutdown back in 2005. On a bipartisan basis, Republicans and Democrats, we fought to keep Ellsworth Air Force Base open. But we were successful in doing so, and today it will become a premier base in the United States Air Force, where the new B-21 stealth bomber will be located. It's the #1 location where they're going with the first 2 squadrons. If we wouldn't have been successful, we wouldn't have been placing that bomber at that base. But then when we got done with saving it and getting it off the list for closure, we also had to have the ability to make it more conducive for development in the future. So we created an authority to actually coordinate taking out some of the businesses that were in the flight path, making sure that there was housing available in that area for the airmen that were going to be there, making sure that there was a plan to actually develop the water system in the area, the sewer system in the area, schools in the area, and so forth. That came through the Ellsworth Authority. The same thing goes on in the city of Sioux Falls, which has got real close to 320,000 people in that region. And they've got a Forward Sioux Falls. Forward Sioux Falls works in conjunction and tries to recommend to us ways in which they can get resources to put into the community. Smaller communities are doing partnerships, and you'll have a regional partnership for economic development in the northeastern part of South Dakota, one in the southeastern part, one in central South Dakota, where they go back in and they'll go to the communities and say, here's how we can perhaps put together the funding and the financing to do the background, the infrastructure, so that you can actually set up and provide a place where housing can be developed. If you don't have those, where you coordinate enough enough individuals together in an area, you'll never get it done. You'll never get the infrastructure in place so you can actually develop the private housing and so forth. So for us in South Dakota, it's huge to be able to have some funding for those economic development or rural development funding agencies to kind of be the seed money to start out. And I don't know, Tina, I think you've got the same challenges in Minneapolis or in Minnesota in your rural areas as well.
Well, yes, absolutely. And, a lot of times what happens is there's sort of a kind of a one size fits all approach that the federal government takes as it's trying to figure out how to be a partner in communities. And Mike and I know that like what works in Bloomington or Minneapolis or Sioux Falls is not going to work in a small town in our states. And so, there's this sort of attitude, I think, that we too often have, which is I'm here from the federal government. Let me help you. Let me tell you what you need that I can do for you, which is just, completely backwards. And so part of what inspired our rural economic working group was to sort of get, kind of flip that on its head and say, no, you tell us what is working so that we can support that good effort. And honestly, a great example of that is the project I talked about just a minute ago with a pilot project between the federal government and local communities to use CDFIs to help provide mortgage loans to folks living on tribal land. That's a project that worked. It was designed at the local level. And now what we want to do is say, okay, let's figure out how we can make that available to more communities and more places around the country. Just another example to play off of what Mike is talking about around collaboration. Rural communities, because they are often resource strapped, have to be creative. They have to really figure out how to make something work when, knit a bunch of things together. And I'm, for example, thinking about a great project in Laverne, Minnesota, which is down in southwestern Minnesota, where you've got a partnership with local businesses and the city and the economic development entities. They're basically saying, we know that there is a huge interest in Laverne. It's a prosperous community. We want to revitalize our main street. So let's do a partnership to help businesses fix up their storefronts on Main Street, which is going to attract more activity, more economic development. And it is working. It's working for the folks that have lived there for decades. But what's also happening, this is in a community that, like a lot of communities, has a real workforce shortage. It's attracting people into the community because this is the kind of place that they want to live in. I saw in the chat a while ago a question about whether, as we emerge from COVID, we're seeing more kind of people who want to leave the cities to move to small towns and having that, wanting to have that small town experience. And I think that's absolutely the case in Minnesota. I bet it is in South Dakota. And so again, this is the opportunity we've got to sort of support that with housing, with locally created and developed economic development ideas, and then having the federal government actually be a good partner there and not a hey, let me tell you how to do it sort of partner.
Yeah, and then Seth, there's one other item that I'd just like to mention on that. We talk about, as Tina says, and it's absolutely correct, rather than having it come from the top down, from the feds telling everybody this is the way it's going to be, when you get your local communities to be able to provide that input, then you know that it's going to work for them if you take that into account. But the same thing applies to the tribes. Remember, the tribes have a separate relationship directly with the federal government. And the one thing that we have a tendency to do is to tell the tribes how we're going to help them, rather than in consultation work through and find an appropriate path forward where they're a partner in getting it done. And so once again, it's a matter of at the local level sharing that knowledge, that information. And then the CDFIs, that's a great example of where the tribe said, this is what's working for us. And but that consultation is critical when we talk about our Native American communities. We've got 9 tribes in South Dakota, and each of them is sovereign, and each of them has a relationship with the federal government. They never signed. I mean, they were never beaten. They signed peace treaties with us, and but they've agreed, and they're sovereign, and they want that consultation.
Thank you for that. And we're running short on time, so maybe one closing question here, and it's really relevant given what's going on, but we strongly believe that housing is a bipartisan endeavor. And so, right now, obviously, there's a lot of housing related provisions in the reconciliation, package that's being pursued. And in 2017, there were also, proposals that would have affected housing there. And, everything from Senator Rounds was actually instrumental in making sure that mortgage servicing rights were not taxed at origination in the 2017 bill, which would have had a detrimental effect on housing. There's similar kind of, proposals with similar potential effects going around right now as far as a minimum book tax. But just, housing is so complicated and really interrelated that not only do we have the housing kind of spending programs, but we also have the impact on the market from the tax side and other economic policy changes. And so I guess the question is with housing kind of as part of this package, how do we make sure that there's still bipartisan kind of collaboration and voices involved in these big policy discussions to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences from either tax change or program changes or spending changes? How do we get more people involved in this? And is there room for that bipartisan collaboration on the big stuff still on the Hill right now?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say briefly that I completely agree that housing policy can and should be, it needs to be an area of bipartisan work. And as you can see from this conversation today, Mike and I are very focused on finding pathways for making that happen. In the reconciliation bill, which will be a Democratic bill, I think that there are some really strong proposals to support housing, both home ownership as well as work to expand access to rental housing. Though the reconciliation bill does not have bipartisan support, I think that many of the provisions in the reconciliation bill are I actually think they have bipartisan support outside of the Congress. And so I think what we've got to do is to, I think it's very important that we push through and we do this. I hear what you're saying. Also, Seth, about how you want to make sure that we don't do, sort of a kind of a do no harm when it comes to the tax provisions as well. And I think that that is very important that we keep that in mind. I believe at the end of the day that we are going to find a path to pass the reconciliation bill as well as the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which Senator Rounds was extremely helpful in helping to negotiate. And when you think about housing, those two bills go together really, really well, because we have on the one hand supporting the very important infrastructure that we have long neglected in terms of roads and bridges and water infrastructure and obviously broadband. And on the other hand, making some improvements to access to housing supply and housing demand and on the demand side that I think will actually have a big impact in small towns and rural places.
Yeah, let me just say, look, there are areas where we can work on a bipartisan basis to number one, assure that we do have the capabilities for financing housing. But let me just give you a couple of examples. We need a national flood insurance policy that's affordable for people, and that's got to be done on a bipartisan basis. When it comes to appraisals, trying to get an appraisal done right now and what the guidelines are for getting a preferred mortgage rate means that you've got to have the availability of appraisers in rural areas in which you may not have a whole lot of sales in order to do a good appraisal on it. And you've got to be able to work your way through that in expanding the area or perhaps relaxing somewhat the number of comparables you've got to have in an appraisal system. I think that the secondary market that right now has got to be available for the mortgage creators in the first place to be able to liquefy once again the asset so they can lend it out again. That secondary market is critical. And that's a part that I think on a bipartisan basis we can work to assure. I also think that we should be talking, and this is one that gets into one that probably is not, we find some challenges to being bipartisan in this, but I really believe that the capital requirements for those banks and so forth, when you increase the capital requirements, it then makes the cost of the interest or the cost for doing business higher, which then gets sent back to the consumer. And I really am concerned that we not go overboard on capital requirements for your lending institutions. The closing costs, whatever we can do to keep closing costs down for that consumer, it makes it that much easier to be able to get into that first house. I'm a believer that while rental units are absolutely necessary, and for some people that is the right approach, but for the vast majority, I think one of the best ways to create wealth is to own your own home. And whatever we can do to make it easier for people to responsibly own their own home, the better it's going to be in terms of those individuals long-term, creating an asset, creating that wealth that really can be passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah, thank you for that. This has been a fantastic discussion, and both of you were so committed and passionate about serving rural America and your constituents. And I just want to thank you for your work. Thank you for working together in a bipartisan way, and appreciate you spending some time with the Bipartisan Policy Center this morning. We look forward to continuing to work with you and supporting your collaborative efforts.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Bye-bye.